Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Do you remember this clone Mega Drive console that I reviewed? You want to see what's in it? You may remember this console from a review that I did a while back. If you haven't seen it, I'll include a card up in here so you can check it out. This is a clone Genesis / Mega Drive console, and it's certainly not the first. There have been a number of these over the years, and it's really not even all that special in some ways, but in other ways, what's really interesting about it is its video output circuitry, and it's a little bit unique in that regard. So I figured, you know what, let's do a teardown. Let's see what's inside this thing. Is it really interesting, or is it just a bunch of cobbled together parts? And then the other thing that I'm curious about is just how well is it physically put together? You know, is it actually worth the money, or was it just kind of slapped together in typical inexpensive fashion? I'm not sure. I haven't taken this thing apart yet. However, I have done some research on the circuitry that's inside it, so I can at least give you an idea as to what it is that we're all looking at. To go over the outside of it real quick, this casing is actually very flimsy and cheap. I'm surprised at how decent of a mold it is. The mold lines and everything are really nice, actually. Like, you would expect that maybe these kind of crisp edges would be a little softer than the original, but they obviously did a good job, you know, reproducing the shell, but it's really lightweight and it's really flimsy, and that's because it lacks any of the metal shielding on the inside. And I can tell that by looking through the bottom. They've got the same vent holes, but you can see bare circuit boards through these vent holes, whereas in the original consoles there was metal under there. So obviously this thing has simply not passed any sort of government certification of any sort, right? In terms of, you know, the fit and finish of the individual external components, this power switch is decent enough. The reset button is just kind of a cheap little tacked switch. On the original ones, it's a little bit softer. This volume slider is just super cheap. It doesn't feel good at all. The headphone jack does work. The controller ports work with original console controller ports. Something really interesting that we'll talk about when we tear this thing down is it's got the cover for where you would attach the Sega CD, but there's nothing in here. There's no edge connector, so you can't actually use it with a Sega CD. And around back, we've got DC input, composite video and audio out, and then this thing's real claim to fame is HDMI. And then this switch gets you back and forth between English and Japanese NTSC mode. So it'll work with NTSC games from either the North American or Japanese regions. It won't work with PAL at all, and then you need to flip this switch to tell it basically which of those two regions you're playing. On some other versions of this console, they're actually labeled either side of the switch. Mine isn't. I don't know why. Let me start taking this thing apart, and then I can give you a little bit more information about this thing. Okay, here we go. Moment of truth. Let's pull the cover off and see how big of a mess this thing is gonna be. Dare I? Okay, we got wires. All right, so I'm not surprised that there's not a whole lot in it. Oh boy, look at this. So check this out. This is the power LED on the top case. They just hot glued the thing in there and soldered a couple of wires to the legs. They didn't even trim the legs or insulate them or nothing. If somebody wasn't careful when putting this together, those legs could have touched and it would have gotten all shorted out and everything. I have a feeling this is going to be an indication of the way the rest of the inside of the console is going to look. So here, according to what research I've done, is the brains of the operation. Literally just this board. This system is what they call a Genesis on a chip, or system on a chip. It's literally just this chip does everything that a Genesis or Mega Drive console would normally do. Hardware clones, true hardware clones, have existed. And there's actually some videos up on YouTube of people who have found these and torn them down, showed you what's inside, where literally the manufacturer of those systems will take an original console apart, completely reverse engineer the entire circuit board, lay out a new circuit board that works the exact same way, and then populate it with all the original chips. So you end up with like really a true hardware clone. It does all the exact same things that the original console does in the exact same way. Well, obviously that costs a lot of money, so manufacturers, clone console manufacturers, started to get wise and are manufacturing these on a chip variants where they basically figured out how does the console work and shrunk it all down into a single chip. And that's really what this board is all about. It takes the cartridge connector and feeds it into this chip, and this chip does the video and the audio and the processing and everything really within itself. This edge connector or pin connector is going to be from the controller ports, and then has a couple extra functions we'll talk about. This is rather interesting what's going on over here. So we've got this resistor that looks like it's kind of bodged on there with a wire, and we've got more extraneous hot glue. Not sure what's up with that. We've got a capacitor laying on its side, so obviously somebody realized, oh, we need that at the last minute. There's an oscillator here, and there's what looks like a good spot for an oscillator, but it's not in there all the way. I'm not quite sure what's going on with that. It's kind of sticking up, flapping in the breeze. Now, exactly how this particular chip works is kind of hard to tell, like what its capabilities are, because it's pretty much impossible to find data sheets on stuff like this, right? These are commodity parts if you know the right places to look for them, but they're not mass market parts. You can't go to like a legit parts resale place. Like here in North America, two really big ones are Mauser and DigiKey. They're not going to carry this kind of thing, right? These are kind of like the back streets of Shenzhen kind of deal. And if there are data sheets on these, they're all going to be in Chinese and they're going to be kind of hard to find. So the exact capabilities of, say, this particular SoC are really pretty much unknown. It's suspected that this thing outputs some sort of RGB signal. I can tell you from other people who have tested this clone console, it will work with an EverDrive, and it will also play 8-bit games, so the Master System stuff, which implies it'll work fine with the power base converter. However, because there's no other I/O on this thing, it won't work with the other peripherals, right? So like, because there's no edge connector over on the side, there's no ability to hook up the Sega CD, stuff like that. So some of this stuff is still a bit of an unknown as for its capabilities, but otherwise it's kind of cut and dried. It plays, 16-bit Genesis Master / Mega Drive games. It also seems to play Master System games, and if you're big into flash cards, it seems to work fine with them too. This is arguably the more interesting part of this entire clone console and is kind of what it's all about. The same crazy build quality continues. Like, we've got a bunch of hot glue over here. I don't know why. Another capacitor laying on its side, not glued down. So they'll hot glue random stuff over here, but they won't glue down this cap. That's nice of them. Thank you. We've got what looks like a voltage regulator with a heatsink on it. At least they thought about that. And there's some hot glue over here. But this ribbon cable is just kind of folded and tucked all over the place and going crazy. The real interesting part of this board is this chip. And this is the video and audio scaler, combiner, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's what takes the audio and visual signals in from that system on a chip and turns them into the outputs. So it controls the composite video and analog audio outputs, but it's also what scales that video signal up to the HDMI port. There are a lot of questions about this chip as well that people still have. It does sound like it can accept multiple kinds of inputs. So the current belief, based on what I've been able to read, it's suspected it takes some sort of RGB from that SoC, but it also seems to be capable of taking in S-video and composite video as well, and then scaling it up. It outputs everything at 720p, 60 frames per second out the HDMI port. One unfortunate thing is that it frames everything in 16:9, so it basically stretches the video out, which for some people is actually a problem because not everyone's TV has the ability to manually set what the aspect ratio of the input signal is. On mine, I was able to tell it specifically, the HDMI input is 4:3, and the TV is smart enough to kind of squash it down on the sides to put it in the proper aspect ratio. But not everyone's TV can do that. So it's really unfortunate that this chip just kind of by default just stretches it out to 16:9, regardless of what the input source actually is. It seems like this chip may be used in some other clone consoles. I'm pretty sure all of the parts in this system are commodity parts, at least as far as clone consoles are concerned. I don't think there's anything really new here. What's interesting about this console is just that these particular parts were put together for the first time. But this chip seems to do everything. The real bummer about this chip, other than the 16:9 thing, which some people can get around, is that this chip only does mono audio, which is really kind of strange to me because it can't be that much more complicated to have it do stereo, but sure enough, it only does mono. So even though the system on a chip down there can do stereo out, this chip only does mono in, and everything coming out of it then is also in mono. So both audio jacks on the back only output mono, even though there's two of them. The HDMI output is mono, and then the headphone jack is also mono on the front, which is another big bummer. And then the other thing is this chip can only accept one output at a time, so you can't use HDMI and composite video at the same time. If you were to hook one of those up and then plug the other one in, the first one gets shut off. So it's nice to see this, and ultimately there's quite a bit of limitation in this video scaling chip. So the fun continues. This is that kind of lower left corner board. This is the power switch, which is just a regular slider switch with this big plastic antler sticking out the top. The reset switch is just one of these, little tack switch deals. Here's your headphone jack. Again, more hot glue, holding everything down, a couple of random caps. This volume slider is just complete junk. It's interesting to see that they included it, but it's really, really cheap. I'm not sure if you can see that very well, but on original, Genesis Mega Drive consoles, if you take them apart, this whole thing is really solid and it's got like a metal casing around it. This one, it's just cheap plastic. And like the last little bit of it's kind of crunchy. It snaps towards the end there. It actually isn't the full range of motion. Like this linear potentiometer is longer than the slider in the top half of the case. So like when you try to push this thing all the way down to 0, it actually isn't at 0 on the pot. Like there's still some more range. It's just bizarre. So I guess I'm not surprised by this. Just single-sided little circuit board, but yeah, you can tell they rushed through this one. All right, and the final board in the system, this one's actually a little bit interesting. On its face, it's just a regular circuit board with a couple of DB9 connectors for the controllers. The ribbon cable then goes up to that system on a chip board. it passes power through from the DC input coming in and over to the switch, and passes some other signals through as well. So this is really just handling the controllers, and then the leads for our flappy little LED power light on the front. More hot glue whiskers around here. What's up with that? What's curious about this board, though, is there's unpopulated components on it. So like there's spots for resistors and a capacitor here that aren't populated, which is weird. Only one of them is. I don't know what this switch is supposed to be for. I mean, there's a marking for one of those tact switches. No idea what that was intended for. Maybe this board gets used in other clone consoles. I'm not sure. Maybe that's for some other system. Anyway, what interests me is this board. This is the receiver board for the included wireless controllers. Those controllers, on these clone systems, a lot of them are IR, which means that you've got to have line of sight between the controller and the console. And if the beam gets interrupted, you lose control of your character on screen. So it's really, the IR infrared controllers are really annoying. This one is all based on RF, and specifically it's based on 2.4 gigahertz RF, as best I can tell. Here's your little squiggly built-in antenna, so they didn't have to stick an extra antenna on there because, that would cost money. We've got some more like hot glue action going on here. So they couldn't even get this add-on board manufactured right. I don't get what's up with that. We've got some glop top chips here. These are more appropriately known as chip-on-board packages. It's most often used for manufacturers to save money. So instead of getting a chip like this one and encapsulating the whole thing in plastic and then soldering it down to the board, a lot of times to save money, they'll just literally glue the die of the chip, the inner workings of something like this, to the PCB itself, solder the legs down, and then drip epoxy over the top of it to encase it and protect it. That saves the money from having to package that chip separately. Sometimes in industry, you'll see these chip-on-board packages used for security purposes, as in the manufacturer doesn't want its competition figuring out how the chip works, because it's really, really difficult to undo one of these. It's really hard to get the epoxy off so you can actually see the die underneath without destroying it in the process. But what's curious to me about this board is, well, one, it actually works pretty well. The wireless controllers included with this console are kind of run-of-the-mill on their own, but they actually work decent. But what's also curious is that this is a modular design, right? The contents of this board weren't integrated directly into this brown board. They're on a separate module that's just soldered through these pin headers. So conceivably, you could take this board off, figure out, which pins control power, feed it power separately, but wire it into a legit Genesis or Mega Drive if you were really inclined. Now, with this console lacking any sort of, RF shielding or whatever, that kind of makes sense. There's an antenna in here. But the other thing to worry about is how noisy are those controllers from an RF perspective, especially if they're on 2.4 gigahertz. I don't have proper test equipment to really go through and tell. And one thing that I didn't do is figure out when those controllers are powered on, if they affect things like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi in a negative way. They may just be, spamming RF in that frequency range all over the place and causing all sorts of interference issues. I'm not sure. If anybody's got one of these consoles and wants to spend the time to do that, I'd be curious as to the results. But this board otherwise seems to actually work surprisingly well. In some ways, this is maybe the best board out of the entire system, just because the rest of them are limited in one way or another. All right, so the last little thing that I'll talk about here before we button this thing back up is, in that review, I was talking about how there's no internal guides for the cartridge slot. So this is the inside of the cartridge doors. It's literally just the 2 flaps with a couple of springs. The problem is on original consoles, there will be an additional piece here that kind of tapers down and helps you get the cartridge as you're inserting it to line up properly with the edge connector, you know, on the main board. The problem with this console is because there's no guide, you can stick the cartridges in, you know, kind of cattywampus at an angle or whatever, and if you're not paying attention or maybe using too much force, you can get the cartridges in there and start scraping the edge connector on the cartridge against the sides of this thing, right? And that's probably bad because you don't really want to damage your cartridges. Some carts are going to be worth more than this thing actually cost. But anyway, so that's the clone Genesis console here. You know, like I said, it's not a horrible system. I paid probably 70-ish bucks, I think, for it. The console itself came in at like 45, and then the rest of it was shipping. So in some ways, maybe I overpaid. But if you really want a way to play Genesis or Mega Drive, at least North American ones, because again, this doesn't do PAL, if you really want a way to play those games with an original controller over HDMI, you know, right now this is kind of the best way to go. I have seen that they are selling a version 2 of this console now that looks like the Model 2 Genesis. So obviously you lose the headphone jack and that sort of thing. I've also seen photos of the inside of that console, and now that I've seen the inside of this one, it's identical. They just use the exact same parts in that fake Model 2 as they did in this fake Model 1. But anyway, if you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.